Welcome. We are Table Goth, and today we're going to talk about lore. Specifically, how much of it you need to use as a new player or storyteller to Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. I am Bully.
And I'm Mandy Morose.
And we probably should have said that before we started, but here we go. Important note, while you don't need all of the lore to run a game of Vampire the Masquerade, you do need dice, specifically dice you buy from us using our link at Level Up Dice. That's the only sort of hard rule. Everything else doesn't matter, as we will teach you soon. But that does matter. So go do that. Help us. Support us. Thanks. First off, Vampire, I think, is unique among a lot of games in the fact that it has so much lore, which is a lot of people's favorite thing about the game. I think it's sort of unique in the way that most RPGs, I always go to the big one, D&D, you don't really need to know anything about like Forgotten Realms or the Pantheons or this and that to just jump in a game of D&D. Most games, you really don't. The storyteller needs to know stuff. They need an idea of what they're doing. As a player, you could just sort of show up. Even as a storyteller, you could just make up your own thing, and no one's expectations is going to be messed up by that, as long as you have your session 0.
It's a much broader world.
Yeah.
I think is a lot of it, too.
Exactly. But with Vampire, it has a lot, very well written, and sometimes extremely, what do I want to say? Detailed. And then also contradictory. It's confusing lore, but it's cool lore. People love it, but it can serve as this huge barrier to the game that, especially as a new player or someone new, especially to RPGs in general, can be sort of daunting. And I see a lot of times sort of our inspiration for making this, and people be like, what do I need to know before I can get into Vampire? And people say, oh, here's a list of 100 episode podcasts that you can listen to and just spend all of your time learning the lore, or these videos. And people love the lore dives. I like them. I've done them. But a lot of people are like, I don't want to play this game because I don't have time to do that.
Yeah. If you have to like learn an entire like history of like, it would be like learning all of like Tolkien's like backstory and languages and stuff before you could understand about like a story about a journey. Like it doesn't have to be as complicated as that, or it can be. It's a personal choice.
Yeah. And that's really what like any other game comes down to. It comes down to your session 0, comes down to what sort of game you want to play and managing the expectations. If you want to run a game that does a deep dive into the lore and you're going to have all your known NPCs in really well-established cities, and you're going to hit sort of some of the big established plots and explore the things that have a lot of book things to get details from, go for it. That's super fun. But I feel like there's a lot less clear direction on what to do if you really just want to pick up and play. It seems like you can't do that with this game, but I'm going to make an argument that you absolutely can. How much lore you know also depends on if you're a player or storyteller. Obviously, if you're a player and you don't want to learn the lore or don't have the time to learn the lore, just want a fresh experience, that's actually fine, because you could just say, hey, I am a new vampire, I'm a new kindred, I'm going to be learning this as my character learns this. That's probably a popular way for a lot of new players to get introduced. That's great. We had fun with that. That's what we did.
Yeah, it was absolutely no effort on my part.
Yeah,
so.
And you still probably don't know any of the lore.
No, I don't.
And that's fine, because it's fine. As a storyteller, though, me personally, I did the deepest of dives. I'm one of those people, I think you're the same way, where I can read a book, I can love the book, it could be my favorite book. 2 weeks later, you ask me anything about that book or to name a character's name, I don't know.
No, details are important.
Yeah, one of my favorite books, I don't dare ask me what happened. Don't ask me about the characters. I don't remember. So that's something, and I think there's a lot of people like that. So if you're like, hey, to play this game, to run this game, you need to know the big NPCs, you need to know locations, you need to know the history, because again, you're playing immortals that have, some of these people have been alive hundreds of years. That can be daunting. But the opposite, sometimes you hyper focus and you retain it all, and that's what I did. Just so I can throw 99% of it out. So ultimately, again, you just gotta decide what you want to do. And as a storyteller, you can get ideas, but again, it's not like you learning the lore necessarily makes the game easier to run. It's one of the more open world games, I think, sandboxy games, if you want it to be, and that's what I love about it. I love a sandbox. I love letting people make wild decisions and giving them wild consequences. So that's why Vampire is really fun for me. But the lore can sort of work against that, which could be good or bad. Again, as a storyteller, if you're confident and just be able to sandbox and run with it, you could take in what you want out of the lore and use it, rely on that, and be like, this cool thing happened in lore. I just sort of want to repeat this from the toolbox. The players don't know, so it'll be fun for them.
I think it gives like context to the entire mood of a story or a game. Like even if you're not using those details like at all, you still have a bigger vision of what can happen and like what other people are expecting. So even if it's not like verbatim those things, you still have like a general direction and mood that you get to like take a story, because you know like these plot points are pretty big in the lore, like you know these uprisings and whatever, like rise and fall of power and things like that. So I think that can give you like a good base for like ideas and feelings that go into your story.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Is I mean, to me, that's what the fun about the lore is, not necessarily in the details or the NPCs, it's the mood. So the lore isn't necessarily about getting the details right as much as getting the mood right. And I think that's the biggest draw to this game for people who have played it forever. And if you're a new player and you've seen this and you're kind of interested in it, it's probably because like the mood seems cool, the aesthetic seems cool. Let me check this out. And it's kind of unique to, it feels different than a lot of the other genres out there. And yeah, I think the lore, if seen as a mood setter, like you said, is probably, especially as a new storyteller, the best way to do it. That's how the books are laid out too. You read any of the books, it's not a history of vampires and here's what's happening and here's what people are doing. It's a bunch of weird like first person snippets that are all just setting a mood and creating scenarios and just giving you it's a vibe. Vampire Masquerade, if you look at the lore as a vibe, you're gonna have a much better time than looking at the lore as facts you need to know and get right and replicate in your game. And I think there needs to be a shift of that acceptance if you want new people into Vampire. Like people don't have the time to learn all the stuff. Like I said, the lore is awesome if you're into it, but to see that as a barrier, like, oh, don't run a game of Vampire unless you know the history of the Camarilla and how the Anarchs broke off and the Dark Ages leading to this and where the Sabbat, like, there's a thing of like, unless you're playing a game that specifically explores one of these things, it's okay to wing it. And this is essentially also what the book implies too. And a lot of the original writers say the same thing. I've seen people talk about like, yeah, I wish we could have just like, and they've done it before. They've dropped whole clans. They've wiped out whole important NPCs and stuff, because especially that's why like 5th edition, it's open to be like, okay, we've removed a lot of the static elements of our lore, of our universe, the things that are the status quo, and now that we've cracked it open, play around and do what you want. And even though they've sort of given you permission in this edition to do that, people still have that hesitation of like, but I still want just the Camarilla works like this, and we need to explore the same. And the people who love the lore, I don't know, it's also interesting because you're essentially, if everyone at the table's a lore junkie, they all know their stuff, then it just sort of becomes we all know our expectation. Yeah, it's like, let's just, it's like a choose your own adventure in a book you already know, in the sense that like, yeah, we know things act like this. We know this is the intentions of this clan. We know this NPC wants this. Let's just watch it play out and sort of be involved. But and some people like that, and that's fine. But that's not, I mean, you could say, well, that's not appealing to a new group. And that's what most of these videos are intended for, actual new, getting introduced to it. If you want to just learn the lore, there's a million resources to do that, and they're well done. This isn't it. Actually, it used to be assumed if you played Vampire, you're playing a Camarilla game. Anarchs was sort of a weird, not well-defined faction. But this
is like super weird for coming out in the 90s.
Yeah, it kind of was.
Like playing the man.
Yeah.
You know? Just
people, playing the status quo, but it was an edgy status quo. People loved it.
That's a whole nother
That's
episode.
another video.
That's
Different, yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, people don't actually want change. They just want to be that
Mm-hmm.
edgy man. But anyway, so this version gives you the Anarch stuff, which again, if you watch stream games, most aren't Anarch. But there's reasons to do that. That's what's sort of weird too, is if you're a new storyteller, Anarch is the most free form, because literally purely your imagination. Anyone who says I don't like Anarch games, or like I don't get why you'd play an Anarch, that's, I don't know. My eyes get too rolling. Because it's just so unimaginative. Because if you're making interesting characters with their own motivations, that literally gives you the most freedom to explore your character's stuff without a mission from the prince and a mission from your
it's like you don't always play like a structured, controlled group of individuals that have like very set hierarchy and like rules that they have to play by in your other games. I mean, sometimes you do, but I think like usually you end up trying to like break those rules the entire time, which is, you know, a whole nother thing. But like that's why I think Anarch is cool, because you don't start with those preset rules. Like you're not just a soldier for a king, you're Robin Hood or whatever
you really want to be. You could literally, it gives you the freedom to do whatever, which can be very scary. But yeah, as a new player, especially if you're used to games where like you know not to attack the town guards, you know there's consequences in that. If you're new to a Camarilla heavy lore game, there's so many rules that you just have to spend time in game explaining the rules to your new character. Not only the lore, but like, yeah, we're not allowed to do this. This person's in charge of that. It becomes almost another lore dump of your city's politics and what positions there are and their domains and this and that. It becomes a whole nother just barrier of info dump that they need to know just to play the game in character. Because
which like a lot of this is obviously for people just playing at home. You're not doing this for an audience. It's not theater that you put on the internet. So like the idea of having to memorize like political structures in a game about vampires, like for at home, that could be a lot. Like that wouldn't be like my personal preference. Some people do really like that, like nitty gritty information. But I don't think people should feel one way or the other. Like it's okay to like either way of doing things, because it is just for you. It's at home with your friends and
yeah, I think people get scared of like, I want to run this game. I love everything. Like I like the idea, like the mood. I want to play vampires, but like, yeah, that's daunting to be like, okay, so I have a prince, but like, who's it? I need to figure out what a seneschal is, and okay, and then now I need to figure out Harpy, and now I need to, like, yeah, it's becomes a thing of where most other games are sort of more pick up and go and just let your,
or they're like everyday ideas that are already like established in society.
And again, if you want to play a heavy, like some people play Vampire as one of the more politically charged games, it's all there. Do it.
Yeah,
it's not a wrong way to play, but it's not the only way to play. And a lot of people think like Vampire is a politics game, so you're going to be playing politics. And again, you end up with the same toolbox as well, especially if you've played with, I don't know why more veterans don't like playing Anarch, because if you've played a bunch of Camarilla games, you've seen the same, like, yeah, there's a power, like, oh, something happened with the prince, and we're going to get involved with that, and, like, one of us is probably going to get a position, and, what, like, it's kind of, covers a lot of the same political structure, because it's a complicated political structure, but not so complicated to where it's going to be wildly different for every game. So, yeah, but as a new storyteller as well, Camarilla sometimes
gives a lot of structure.
Yes.
And like tells you exactly where to go and how to get there, which also like it's almost like what's the word? Like a module in a way. Maybe you said that earlier, but like it is kind of like a module. So sometimes that could be the right amount of structure to get you going.
Yeah, Camarilla, while it seems like the biggest lore barrier, also if you have players that are so new that they're like, I don't know what to do, I want someone to tell me what to do. A Camarilla game's great for that, especially if you're as a storyteller do know the lore, because there's so many rules in place that it's very easy to direct your group on what to do and how to do it. Most of the work on the player doesn't necessarily have to come from learning the lore as much as really having a well thought out and character and having a motivation, having a desire, ambition, to use game terms and things like that. And then playing with that. That's why really, if you have really, really strong character concepts and backstories, and you sort of have your general mood, your dark setting, you can play a whole game not even touching on vampire lore. Like, it doesn't matter who Cain is or this or that. If you're really exploring the personal horror aspect of vampire, none of the lore covers that, because again, that's a personal story for the players. But on sort of the other side of that coin, again, it goes back to that's kind of overwhelming. That's a harder character to create than a character in a lot of other games. So that's a big thing you have to ask yourself is, how much lore do I need to know, especially running a game versus playing a game, is what sort of character do I want to play, and how much direction I want from the world, how much outside influence I want driving me versus how much freedom I want to explore the story I've created.
I think, yeah, there's different challenges and different ways of going about it. It's kind of like, which challenges do you want? Like, do you want the like having to memorize or learn a ton up front, or do you want to have that learning curve that you're going to get past pretty quickly, but it is still like, that could be frustrating when you're starting the game. You could feel like you don't know what you're doing, and that can make it not fun. But also it can be really interesting to learn as you go. So there's like just different ways of playing, and I think those really go into which way you decide, like which sounds better to you.
Also, a way the lore can be helpful if you need ideas, but also harmful if you're someone who truly wants to just sort of bring your own thing to the table and make it work, is the clan system. People love the idea of like, a clan is this. If you're this clan, you act like this. You have these powers. You have this history, and you have this sort of role you want to play. Which, if you presented that in most games, that sounds really restrictive and unappealing, I would say, to a lot of people. It's like, oh, like, people love it, like showing off how they've broken the mold of like their class stereotypes. And there's not as much support for that necessarily in a lore heavy thing.
Yeah, it becomes like pre-made characters in like a video game or something. Like, you have to play this way and with this style, and you'll only like increase your abilities in this way. And like, you just have like a pre-made character, no matter what your character is. In the end, their stereotype is controlling every decision they make, rather than like the character actually having agency in your game. And again, like, there's structure there if that is what you like or what you need to get started. But don't ever feel like your character has to be exactly this way or that way just because there is a stereotype. I mean, I don't think any of us play games like this because we like to be put into a stereotype or a mold. So why would you play a character like that?
Yeah, most characters, again, this doesn't have a class system. When you look at a class, that class doesn't have a personality attached to it. Vampire is interesting because there's personalities attached to character creation, like parameters. Which could, again, and then people are like, well, I'm playing a Toreador who doesn't act like a Toreador. I'm saying, that's, I guess, fine, that's interesting. But I'm more interested in you just play a character who acts like your character, and then where they fall in the grand scheme of things. Because it's, I would be very interested, and I've toyed around the idea of literally just a clanless vampire game. Like, a vampire is a vampire. And figure that out, play around with that. How do you organize from that without, well, we act like this because of this, we act like that. But again, a lot of that lore is really cool. A lot of it comes from, they kind of got away from it, but the core clans really all represent different aspects of like classic vampirism that's fun to explore. So they're there for a reason, and they're really good what do you call it, tools to build a character. And if you want to just make like, oh, I love everything about this stereotype of a Nosferatu, I'm going to play this, that's fun.
Yeah.
They're
built there for a reason.
Ideas,
They've like existed this long outside of the game for a reason, because they're really interesting. But
as soon as I hear like, well, you need to play them like this, that's when you get creative, get an imagination, my person. Because yeah, people run into that too. Because I mean, we get comments on that of like, why is your Hakata acting like this? Because it's a fucking person. It's a character. It doesn't, whatever. And again, to me, I'm like, do those people just want to see just like simulations of like, I don't know. It's like
like you want to see the character you think of played out in front of you. Like
Yeah.
you want them to act this way because that's what you already like have as your assumption in your head. That doesn't work that way.
Yeah, there's a lot of people with that mindset, which can also be intimidating for a new player. If like, oh, I want to play this, but like, am I playing a Toreador right? Am I playing a Ventrue right? Like, that's no one should feel like that as a because you're just creating a person, ideally.
Yeah.
And that's why I watch our character creation videos. We recommend create a person first. Check out the vampire stuff later. Because most people, if you say, I want to run a game, what do you need to know? Someone's going to say, learn the clans, and then learn, your what sect you want to be, and then build your structure. And which, again, that's a lot of information. There's 13 clans. There's a lot of information if for a new person starting off. If I'm starting a different game, I don't need to know every class in the book to run a game, because
I just need to know what my players are playing.
Yeah,
And how to build off of that.
Exactly. I'm just gonna make an NPC and out of stuff. I don't need to know how they all interact with each other, what their opinions are of each other, what their history of the clans is with each other, which also informs how they react to each other. Again, really fun if you're into that, but you really don't have to. And I don't think enough people acknowledge that. We touched on NPCs a little bit, where again, this is a game where people love their lore NPCs, and people will drop them in just again for the wink nudge to the audience of like, hey, that's Beckett. It's pretty cool, huh? And it can absolutely be. And again, good inspiration for stuff, but then it gets weird, especially if you're playing with veterans. Everyone has such a preconceived notion of, talk about the preconceived notion of a clan, an actual established lore character. They're really going to be like, they need to act and do and react this way. And I've never been one on using them, but other people use them a lot, and some people love it. But you don't, I think as a storyteller especially, you really don't have to, you don't have to know any of the the canon NPCs are, unless you're playing a game
set in that environment. Yeah.
And then setting, that's another one too. It's the one thing you don't have to learn in Vampire, which is nice, is where the modern world. So there's so much, maybe that's why they do so much lore, because they don't have to actually world build or name countries and gods and stuff. So you just get to jump in, and you already know so much just by being a person in society. But some cities, that's the setting in this. The cities are very fleshed out. And a lot of people be like, oh, I live in Chicago. I want to run a game that me and my players know the city. We're going to run a Chicago game. There's a whole book about Chicago. So people be like, I guess I need to learn, like, who's in charge of Chicago? Who are the big players? What's going on? Not enough people realize, like, you could just do what you want. I've seen a lot of people ask questions like that of, like, I live in this small city. There's no lore for my city. What do I do? And that's such a weird reaction to, like, just... It's no matter where you live, do what you want. But if someone's already done the work for you, that could be fun. But it's also, we ran Fall of London. We've done a module, and I found it's not a module for a classic adventure game is nice, because they do the grunt work for you as much as you have encounters, you have stats, you have maps, all the things that are hard to come up with or take a lot of prep time are done for you. So it's really enticing. A module for Vampire isn't necessarily that as much as it's a bunch of NPCs and motivations and things like that. So it's learning people more so than they're not really doing the work as far as I had to do more work, because I remember an NPC better if I made them up than if they're presented to me.
How did you feel about like locations as far as playing a module set in the modern day, like actual society? Because I feel like that makes it difficult to be set in another city that like I've never been to. So like when you were talking about like, okay, we're gonna meet here, like I think part of Vampire that's so cool is like, okay, we're gonna go meet at the Arch, and like, oh, I know where the Arch, like I drive past there, like I have context about everything around it, like I understand like everything like about the traffic or like the local restaurants or the type of nightlife that's nearby. But like being in London, I was like, I don't know what this, like, I don't have any idea of what turning a corner would be like, you know, those kinds of things, like that visual. Yeah. Did you ever feel like you had to do work to describe things or like make it clear, like how to access points or locations?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of things I had to juggle with that. But yeah, to me, I love running a game in a city that me and my players live in.
Mm-hmm.
So I recommend that because it's again fun and again it's and that's one like if there was an established St. Louis lore, there's a little. I feel like that would I don't know. I feel like I had so much more fun making that up with my
Mm-hmm.
players because you're like, okay, who's in charge of the arch? I
Mm-hmm.
want to check this out.
Yeah.
And if it's well, it's already figured out they did this.
Mm-hmm.
Especially most of the writers probably haven't lived in the city, and you can
Mm-hmm.
always kind of tell a little bit. The only side note, the only little bit of like mod V5 St. Louis lore, we made it in a book. We made it in Cult
Mm-hmm.
of the Blood Gods, is one of the places where Church of Cain is. But they're in Six Flags, and anyone who lives in St. Louis knows that's not.
It's not the city.
That's a chunk away. It's not even like,
Yeah.
oh, it's not
It's
technically the city, and like that's a bit of a drive
It's like
from
in the
the
middle
city.
of nowhere.
Yeah, and also like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing St. Louis about Six. Like I don't
Mm-mm.
know. Is it Six Flags and Mold? I don't know. It's
Mhm.
something you could tell.
Yeah.
It wasn't a native who wrote that. It's a cool idea. They
Mhm.
probably put it there because we're like the Rome of the West. We're a very
Uh-huh.
Catholic, religious city.
Uh-huh.
So they took some of those cool ideas, but I always think as natives are gonna do a better job
Yeah.
and have more fun figuring that out. But also, some people really like the it's sort of the theme of like a bigger city that people have an idea. People when you say New York, everyone has an idea of that.
Mhm.
So you can still do stuff in other
Yeah.
places, and people have a general idea. So you don't have to just necessarily establish every little bit. But yeah, it's another lore thing. People are really hesitant about running a game in a city with before figuring out what's the official lore of what's
Mhm.
happening in the city. Who cares? Because
Mhm.
your coterie is not actually affecting
Mhm.
the published lore, but people really want to know like
Mhm.
what's going on officially before I
Mhm.
do anything, and that's another barrier potentially or motivation, depending how you look at it. But it can be a barrier that
Mhm.
you are allowed to ignore. Getting back into the books, like I was talking about how they're written in again just very mood heavy.
Mhm.
Again, they give you lore, they give you things that happened,
Mhm.
but they're mostly there to sort of get you in the mood to play vampire. I feel like a lot of them are. One of the very useful sections in the main book, which again not set up the best way because it is so mood heavy
Mhm.
for just trying to straight get mechanics. But there's a section. I think the chapter is literally just called Vampires. It's one of the first things. It's Truth and Lies. My book, page 201, if you're looking. That literally just says like it's just a list of things that what sort of the modern idea of what a vampire is, and if that's true or not in this setting.
Does it talk about if they're
What's
like
this?
sparkly?
Yeah, I think maybe. Like the first one says vampires are immortal. True. And then it says how that is. Vampires are the living dead. True. And then even the more talks about sunlight. A stake through the heart kills a vampire. False. Puts them in a torpor. They got to explain what torpor is. That little snippet, that chapter.
So succinct.
Yeah.
In comparison.
Yeah, that part of the book does a great job of like honestly, if you're a new player,
Mhm.
that's or a new storyteller, you
Mhm.
could really just read those few pages and just know, okay, these are how the rules of how vampires work in this world. So the
Supposed to work.
mechanics we're using sort of
Should
apply to
reflect
that, and you're sort of good to go.
That's nice.
And it's something that most people probably either ignore or just sort of skim through because, again, most veterans, we know all this stuff. We know a
Mhm.
stake doesn't kill a vampire unless you have that flaw, put you in
Mhm.
torpor and this and that.
Mhm.
Because, again, we did the deep dive. But it can be as simple as just knowing, like, okay, vampires still get burned by the sun,
Mhm.
vampires still do that. Or not. You can make that up, too. That's fine. But that's...
Everything has an exception too. Like if you have like you're not scared of
have
crosses.
this merit or have
yeah,
this...
it's like I'm not actually afraid of churches unless this, or I can act like everyone can go inside a building unless you have this. Like
Mhm.
there's so many like again, it gives that contradiction. Like you do not have to play by these rules and these rules only. There's always an option to do something else. And that's really cool.
That's very cool. Very cool game. For cool people. For everybody.
For all the people.
The good thing to figure out too is if you're like, I want to play this game or I want to run this game, at why.
Mhm.
Whatever that why is, that really determines what your next step is. If your why is, I love the stories, I love what I've seen so far, I want to dive into it. There's so many awesome resources for that. Tons of books to read, tons of videos, podcasts, all the above. Check it out, do your dive. and just make sure your group wants to dive with you, or you can be just have all the lore in you and just present it, and it'll make you seem super creative and interesting while using someone else's ideas. This is what being a good anything's all about. But if your idea is like, I just like I'm a vampire person. I have my ideas of what a vampire is, what I like about vampires. And then you're like, oh, it doesn't really match up with the lore in this game. Let's do it anyway. That's fine. It's if you want your vamps to sparkle, I would gladly run a Twilight vampire game actually. But yeah, that's the thing too, is there's so much cool vampire media. Some people might love, like, if you watched Underworld and you love that like super actiony, I want vampires to be fighting werewolves, and I want a vampire and a werewolf to have a baby, and I want all these things to happen. It doesn't really work in the lore.
But Boo makes it work.
Yeah. Shout out to Boo dating a werewolf. But yeah, you can literally just do that, and I think the best part of this game to take away lore wise is I really like the concept of the beast. I really like the hunger die mechanic. Playing with that, I think, is something you should definitely take from this game, although you don't have to, but I think is a big part of the drama, if that's the mood you're going for. And like I said, I love the World of Darkness mechanic system.
I think it's really accessible.
Yeah, like I said, especially it's designed to let you do what you want, more so than other games, which again can be intimidating, but everything about this and in this edition is they're just telling you, like, we've taken away all the barriers pretty much. Just take this and run, and you're allowed to do that. Just don't do it online, because people will probably be mad at you if you're not doing it right, but that's okay too. This is also a game with a meta plot, which is also kind of unique. A lot of other games don't necessarily have that, to where like this side won this war in this year. But I mean, a lot of times it's history to games, but like it's history to where like you're always sort of playing the good guys or the people on this side. This is, I mean, it's all over the place how you could have been involved in those historical events, or real life historical events. Those are fun cameos to do too.
I think the points in history are sometimes personally more interesting to me than like pre-made individual like characters. Like sometimes like the overarching like flow of history and how things have changed can be a little more interesting.
Yeah.
Again, like the reason those things are so important, like the meta plot is so prevalent, super small world. Like even like literally there's not that many kindred left.
Yeah, honestly, this almost encourages the small things less than a lot of other games. Intimate. You're saving the world, or you're defeating a big bad, or you're becoming the king or the prince in this case. You could truly have like a really rewarding and you get a lot of content out of it, of just exploring like your character's personal horror, their personal journey, them adapting to things, or them dealing with the consequences of this, or stuff like that. There's you can have, like I said, tons of lore out there. You can zoom in on such a small level, and to where it's literally you're just dealing with this coterie and their families, and that could just be a lot of content.
It's so intimate. Like it's such because it is so personal, and everything is so much more about communication, and so it does make it like every interaction is like two people, and it's the most important thing that happens the entire night, and it can just be like a conversation or like a revelation or something. Yeah,
that's an option. And again, a lot of people, they start with such the huge meta plot and all this stuff. You don't really need it. Like what does the person who's been turned but they still need to provide for the family, why do they care what year the second city fell and the 13th? Like it doesn't matter. They're trying to figure out how to explain to their family what's happened, or hide it from their family, and while dealing with this person who's getting suspicious about it. Like that's just as interesting of a story, and I didn't need 20 tomes to figure that out, or to be allowed to play in that space. So we've talked about how really you could throw out most of the lore, all the lore if you want, and still have a really good game. But if you had to pick like essential, like you still want to run a vampire game in spirit, you still want it to be recognizable as something that follows the lore, what's the bare minimum that you think we'll do it from a player standpoint, from you, a player needs to know necessarily? Like even though you go in as a new kindred learning the ropes, what do you think would have been useful to know about the world? Well, maybe even for creating a
Mm-hmm.
character, because again, it's nice to create a character having some idea how they're going to interact with this lore,
Mm-hmm.
interact with this setting before making them.
Uh, I don't know how important it is, but it was a hang up for me that took me a really long time to like stop doing. Uh, Kindred are really powerful. Even like brand new baby ass Kindred, still super powerful.
Baby asking.
Baby ass. And like I kept playing it like a human that could get hurt or was probably weaker than the next person walking down the street, which was like ridiculous. Like that was just something I kept fucking up. Like I wouldn't like go for anything because I just thought like there's no possible way that I could like withstand this damage or whatever. And that wasn't the case, and it took a long time.
Yeah, it's almost the opposite of where a lot of people are like
Mm-hmm.
power gamers, murder hobos.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that makes sense. That yeah, because playing you played a brand new
Mm-hmm.
vampire in our home game, or it's not a home game, but our original game. But we played you as a human, and
Mm-hmm.
session one was day one of your transformation. And yeah, I guess it is sort of interesting learning what you can and can't do and how that interacts
Mm-hmm.
without sort of testing the limits, which
Mm-hmm.
can be kind of fun, but also
Yeah.
I can think of a few scenes we sort of
Mm-hmm.
learn the hard way, like I've gotten this bad situation, I don't know what to
Mm-hmm.
do, I'm panicking, and someone's
Yeah.
like, "Hey, we have vampire powers. You forget this happened. You
Yeah.
go over there," and you're like, "Oh yeah, I could do that."
Yeah. Which can like be good for a story, but
Yeah.
like as a player, it was really like it gave me a lot of anxiety that I did not eventually like I didn't know the true potential that a character could have. And so I think some of that was like being fairly new to tabletop games, but also just like a jump of game type. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you are literally undead, like, and you have magical powers.
Yeah, that is an interesting way to think of it too. Like lore wise, is if you play a level one character most games,
Mhm.
like you fuck around and you're gonna
Mhm.
find out.
Mhm.
You can't just go around the world
Mm-hmm.
interacting with things. But in this, yeah, from day one kindred, a lot of the game makes you feel small, especially
Mhm.
in the Camarilla game. Like you're a fledgling, you're nothing.
Mhm.
There's all these rules in place
Mhm.
and things you can and can't do. But
You're still.
to 99% of the humans around
Mhm.
you, which is pretty much the setting,
Yeah.
you're crazy strong.
Yeah, you're literally a predator.
Someone can walk up and shoot you and you're
Mhm.
fine, more or less.
Yeah.
Like, so it's like wild things are like superhuman things, but because that's not the mood of the game, the game feels
Yeah,
so
you don't play-
consequence heavy,
Yeah.
and the game feels
You're not
scary.
playing a superhero.
Yeah.
You know.
So yeah, that's interesting. So I guess as a player, I guess lore wise, what you would have want to known is
Yeah, just,
more the
like-
capabilities, what your powers,
Yeah.
how they actually interact with things.
And that like they're truly like an apex predator, even at their like lowest level.
Which is also one of my favorite things of the game. The opposite side of that, once you figure that out
Mhm.
and you start leaning into that, it's a
Mhm.
very quick, slippery slope
Mhm.
into the beast, and you start finding out the consequences
Yeah.
of having unchecked power. Something's eventually going to check it.
It's like the player and the character are simultaneously learning these things,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. Yeah, a good lore thing to know, I guess, a player is just essentially, yeah, your discipline, the mechanics, really.
Mhm.
Which every game has that barrier. You should at least learn the mechanics.
Yeah.
And this is honestly kind of easier because you need to learn disciplines. All the other mechanics are real life skills.
Mhm.
You see drive, you see intelligence, you see medicine. You know what those are.
Mhm.
You don't have to learn a class feature or whatever.
Yeah.
So really, disciplines is
Mm-hmm.
is a lore thing. I think yeah, a player going in should
Mhm.
know.
And you just write notes so you remember what it means actually, and then how to roll for it, and then yeah, just a lot of notes, little flashcards or
And
something.
notes. Yeah, I gave you little sheets to help you out.
Yeah, it helps a lot because I can't remember anything.
Yeah, that's very good. As a storyteller, if you're trying to play again, keeping the spirit of Vampire, not just straight doing your own thing, it's still true to the setting. I think the bare minimum you need to go in knowing is, I guess, the clans, because that's
Mhm.
what your players are going to be playing. They're going to have compulsions and banes based off of that, and that will sort of reflect other people. But again, I encourage you to I build NPCs the way I tell people to build players. I create an interesting antagonist or NPC,
Mhm.
something to populate the world, and I'm like, okay, what clan would this be? And
Mhm.
sometimes it's fine to be like, oh, I
Mhm.
like the idea of like this clan. I just want more of this clan. Do
Mhm.
that too.
Yeah.
That's fine. But essentially, gather the clans, and really lore wise, you just need to know how, which is also largely up to you, how
Mhm.
the world interacts with kindred society.
Mhm.
Um, you need to figure out sort of the rules for that as far as lore wise, because again the antagonists in these games are really humans. Second
Mhm.
Inquisition is more of a main antagonist in this version than in other
Mhm.
editions. As a storyteller, once you discover or once you decide and your players decide what sect you want to be, decide your antagonist. Whether the antagonist could be no one, the antagonist could be
Mhm.
themselves.
Mhm.
It could be the status
Very
quo, either
contained.
making sure it remains or fighting against it.
Mhm.
Or if you want your antagonist to be the Sabbat, then you got a little more digging to do, learn what the Sabbat's about. Or if you want it to be Anarch versus Camarilla, learn those sides. But yeah, that's the basics. The history, especially this edition, literally says most of the history doesn't matter
Mhm.
anymore. There was a whole like apocalyptic war thing, and antediluvians rose, whole clans were wiped out, and now they're back. And it's
Mhm.
again, they did that because I feel like they want to give players the options to do what you want. So lore wise, as a storyteller, there's a daunting amount of
Mhm.
history and named NPCs. Those really are only viable if you want them to be, if
Mhm.
you want to explore those. The only things you really need to know is again how kindred society and your world interact.
Mhm.
There's lore to that.
Mhm.
The Second Inquisition, which we're getting a book on soon, so there might be actual lore to that, but otherwise it's a boogeyman that you could do what you want with. Then the clans, and of
Mhm.
course the traditions.
Yeah.
But again, those matter more in a Camarilla game.
Mhm.
Again, but if my response is going to be what your players want. If they're like, well,
Mhm.
I want to play a political game, now you need to learn the Camarilla.
Mhm.
Probably, I'm assuming that's what they want to do. If you need to learn the hierarchy, the
Mhm.
positions. It all depends on what they want. But bare minimum, you really just need to learn. Really, it's that chapter I said
Mhm.
where it's just like what happens to vampires in the sun. Um, are they scared of crosses? What's feeding like for
Mhm.
them? Just get the basics down and then decide what sort of story you want to tell with
Yeah.
that.
Gives you the bones of it.
Yeah, and you don't need to create encounters. You don't need to stat a bunch of NPCs. Just figure out other
Mhm.
interesting characters to populate in your world. So at bare minimum, this can be a pretty the prep comes from it's a different kind of prep. You don't
Mhm.
have to worry about stat blocks and encounters and challenge levels and rewards. You
Mhm.
just need to create more in-depth NPCs and problems and things to explore,
Mhm.
which to some people is a lot harder, but to
It's a
some,
lot of like really storytelling.
yeah. But to
Instead.
some, I can make up an NPC
Mhm.
and embody that and play it off the fly.
Mhm.
If I'm running an encounter for a different game,
Mhm.
I need to make my notes and have my spreadsheet and figure out
Mhm.
my numbers, which to me takes a lot longer, is less fun. But to some people, it's easier to rely
Mhm.
on something static than
Mhm.
have this flowing improvisation character at the ready. But yeah, so bare minimum entry if you want to get in this game, very easy. And we should discuss the books because again,
Mhm.
it's we're talking about barriers of entry, things you
Mhm.
need to play the game. So I people are like, what books do I need? There
Mhm.
are so many. If you're playing old, this is one of those interesting games where the old editions still are part of the new
Mhm.
edition. I don't need a D&D 3.5 book to play D&D 5th edition.
Mhm.
None of that matters at all to me. In Vampire, if you want a lot of the history and why things were this and what happened, you need those books because
Mhm.
they tell a complete story. Um, but again, if you just want sticking strictly 5th edition, you technically just need the main book, which lets you create characters,
Mhm.
gives you plenty of story tips and ideas and how to create coteries and characters and settings, and that's really all you need. Of course, they have one specifically for the Camarilla.
Mhm.
If you want to play a Camarilla game, great stuff for that. They got an Anarch book. If you want to play an Anarch, great stuff for that. Although really, to me, Anarch is
Mhm.
everything that's not Camarilla.
Mhm.
Like you can play in the Anarch movement, a
Mhm.
revolutionary game, or you could just play a game that doesn't have Camarilla rules.
Just a regular old kindred.
Like a little kindred. Technically is autarkist or whatever, but just it's I we don't need to get into all the specifics of that. But yeah, those are options. Those books also have like other clans and powers in them. And that's what a lot of these books, if you want all the goodies, all the options, all the disciplines, they're sort of spread out a little bit. But if you just need like, I need to know what book I need to read to know how to play a game lore wise, you just need the one. And the one gets pretty sweeping broad strokes for a reason, because that's all you need. You don't need all the details. Like I said, there's at the time of this recording, one module, Fall of London. Yeah, that's the only one that's just a straight contained story.
Full, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really I enjoyed it, but it was very interesting running compared to other modules and other systems. Because like I said, the work it does for you is so much different than what I usually a module is doing for you. Then of course we get close. Most of the other books that are coming out are essentially just snapshots of different settings. Either settings of the cults of the blood gods. You get snapshots of this clan, the Hakata, and how cults work in this world. Some powers that go with that. Chicago is a great one too. It's essentially just a collection of NPCs, which, again, any other, like, if I bought a D&D book and it was just all NPCs, I'd be like, I don't really need this. How does this apply to this story or this setting or whatever? But that's super useful. And to me, if you were brand new and you really wanted lore help, something like Chicago by Night I think might be the most useful, because they're all really well organized, really in-depth NPCs that you can drop in any city and just twerk a few details. It's another thing that seems like a barrier. If I want to get into Vampire, I'm like, okay, the handbook's out, the Camarilla book's out, the Anarch book's out, Chicago's out, Cults of the Blood Gods out. There's these smaller supplement things. Second Inquisition's coming out, Sabbat's coming out. It seems like, okay, I need to buy 7 or more books to play the game, when, again, and most of that is lore, so it seems like a huge barrier, but it's just, it's fluff. And I say fluff in a positive way. It's fun fluff, but it's just that.
It's
you
the
don't...
spice.
It's the spice.
But not the broth.
The spice, but not the broth. That's what lore is in, in Vampire. Remember, if you take 2 things from this video, lore is a vibe, lore is the spice, not the broth. Because the broth is...
Page 201. It's the basics. It's the thing you need. It's the thing you need.
The broth is the thing you need.
This is really devolved.
The lore is the spice.
I'll make a graph later.
We're not being useful to anyone anymore.
No.
Someone out there gets it. That's gonna connect. What do I want to title this? Just like
to lore or not to lore?
Okay.
I mean, that's just like off the top
No
of my
bad
head.
ideas. Welcome. We are Table Goth. And today, we're going to talk about lore, Vampire the Masquerade, specifically. What lore do you... I don't know. All right, now, I need to think about it. I thought it would come to me.
They don't expect professionality from us. They expect personality.
That's something you inhaled.
No.
Okay.
Sorry. I'll breathe quieter.
Yes.
Can we get the lore as a vibe on a t-shirt? Or like
Honestly,
a hat?
yes.
Can we get like a dad hat and get
Look,
the
I
lore as a vibe?
got a merch shop now. I haven't opened it, but have I made any points? I just said random things.
I think the point we've made is that there's no wrong way to play the game unless you're being a dick.